how the stock market works, but now we want to tell you about how the market takes a tremendous hit in 1929. And there are not a lot of specific days that I would tell you to remember, but October 29th, 1929 is definitely one of those days. It's what we call, or what historians would refer to as Black Tuesday, and it's there for a reason. You see right here, here's what's going to happen. Here's the trend of the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the 1920s and the late 20s, and you can see that it's peaking in October of 1929, and it's getting so high, and there's a really bad trend that was happening here. People presumed that stocks were going to continue to increase over time. Okay, the trend was you buy a stock, and most businesses were prospering, so the value of that stock was going to increase. All right. But on October 29th, 1929, there is going to be a tremendous drop in the Dow. You can see that drop there on Black Tuesday. It's a steep drop, and the Dow's going to lose about 30% of its value in one day. And if that, to give you an idea of what that would look like in today's world, the Dow closed around 35,000 recently, and imagine if it lost a third or 30% of its value. We're talking a drop to about 23,000 from 35,000. That would crush a lot of people's market portfolios. Okay, so the market's going to take a hit here, and you can see that Black Tuesday is just the beginning. The trend of the stock market is going to go downward for the next 3 years. It's an ugly time to have money invested in the market. People panic and start selling their stocks, and that causes a ripple effect. Now, we briefly want to touch on the reasons why. People understood, or they come to realize on October 29th, that many of the companies that they had invested in were overvalued. So let's say that a stock price was $100 a share, and people realized that that company isn't quite as valuable as what we thought. There had been what's called a speculative bubble, meaning that people thought the stock was more valuable than what it really was, and then when they realize it, that bubble bursts and that price plummets. So when you realize your company isn't as valuable as you thought, you panic sell, or at least most people will panic sell just to get rid of it in a hurry. Now, here's what happens on October 29th. There is a coalescing of several different things. A couple famous investors in Great Britain on their market were found to be defrauding people, and people presumed that if major investors were major stock traders were defrauding people about the stocks they were selling, then that could happen to their business too. Many businesses hurt themselves by overproducing during the 1920s. For example, if you were a company that made refrigerators, refrigerators are not a product that you have to replace often, and they presumed that people would keep on buying refrigerators at the same rate they always had. But unfortunately, any market gets saturated eventually, meaning that nobody needs refrigerators or as many refrigerators this year as they might have last year. And so we find out those companies are overvalued. They're not as good as what we thought. Some companies misled investors and lied about how much they were profiting or how much business they were doing. And because of that, people start panic selling on October 29th. Even if their business was sound, people got scared and were concerned that their business might have done something shady or illegal, and so they went ahead and sold it anyways to try to play it safe. Okay? And that massive sell-off on October 29th causes that huge plummet in the market, and it's not going to recover for the next 3 years. So when that happens, people who had money in the stock market are absolutely crushed. Now, most Americans didn't have money invested in the stock market. Probably less than 5% of Americans owned stock at that time. So most people thought, yeah, if you're really wealthy or you had a lot of stock, obviously this is going to hurt you. But there are going to be tremendous problems after that. First, let's take a look at the people who lost a lot of the money in the stock market. These people are desperate for cash, and you see that the next day's headlines are going to reflect the importance of this. Wall Street is in a panic as stocks crash, and then you see pictures like this famous image, this man selling what looks like to be a relatively new automobile, he needs money. And he's like, I'm willing to part with this for a significantly lesser value than what it's worth. So you tried to acquire as much cash as humanly possible. Uh, there are reports, and a lot of them were overstated, but some people had almost all their money tied up in the stock market. And when the values of those stocks plummet, uh, they end up just killing themselves. That's not the norm, but there are some notable examples of that because they just don't know how to live without their wealth. Now, the stock market crash is going to really touch off what we call the Great Depression. Okay, and I want to give you a concept of what a depression is. An economic depression is a time period of a slowed economy marked by high rates of unemployment. And you can see right here, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, these people are unable to find work. They don't have a lot of money, and there are a lot of local places who are going to provide coffee, donuts, soup for people who are unemployed. And what you should be aware of is initially, these were not government-sponsored programs. These are people who did this out of the goodness of their heart. Private charities or business owners who tried to do things to help out their community. So you have this period in the 1930s where there's going to be extremely slow periods of economic growth. And here's what happens after the stock market crashes. You're going to see there's going to be a huge ripple effect that comes out from it. Let's talk about the causes of this depression. The stock market crash is one of those indicators that something is very wrong. The biggest cause of the Great Depression is undoubtedly going to be the failure of banks. Okay? Banks are going to go out of business. You take a look at this trend over time, and from 1926 all the way down to 1933, we're talking about thousands of banks that have to close. Okay? And how does a bank go out of business? That's literally where all the money is kept. And here's how that happens. Banks, typically people put their money in a bank because it's a safe place. And you don't need all your money at once. You don't want to keep a large quantity of cash at home. Somebody will try to take it from you. You're always looking over your shoulder. So people put it in a bank as a safe place. Plus, if you store your money in a bank, they will pay you a small percentage of interest. So you collect additional money just by parking your money there. Now, the bank presumes that you're not going to need all your money at one time. So what they do in order to make money is they're going to give out loans, personal loans, business loans. Those are common for banks to do. If somebody comes in and has an idea for a business, they have a sound business plan, the bank will loan them, let's say $250,000 to start up a business. And they presume that that business, they have a good model for that, and they're going to make some money, and that business is going to pay back monthly payments, just like if you borrowed money to buy a house or a car. Here's the problem that resulted. Many people back in the 1920s, it was a common practice, and this was legally permissible, that you could borrow money from a bank to invest in the stock market. And because the trend of stocks were always going up, anybody with a good track record of paying back their loans was probably considered a good risk. So if you have a stockbroker who wants to borrow money to buy a stock that he thinks is a sure thing, that was legally permissible. Now, here's the problem that results from that. Because so many people had borrowed money from banks and banks themselves had invested in the stock market, when the market crashes, those banks have a bunch of worthless stock that they can't sell to get back any cash. So now banks don't have a lot of cash on hand. And that panics people because when they show up to try to get their money, and they do, they see this happening, what's called a run on the banks. These particular banks right here, people show up because they're like, hey, we know banks invested in the stock market and they loaned out money to stockbrokers, and now I better go down there and get my cash or I may never see it again. And back in the 1920s, if your bank closed for some reason and you had, let's say in your checking account, let's say you had $2,000, you just didn't get the money back, okay? And this is significant because banks are important for providing not only a safe place for people to park their money, but at the same time, they provide business loans home mortgages, loans for automobiles. Now they even provide loans for education in some instances, or personal loans. And if banks aren't there, businesses can't start or keep going. Banks scramble around and try to contact businesses and saying, we need our money back now, but they're unable to pay it all back at once. So here's the thing: banks don't have enough cash. The bank tries to foreclose on a business loan because they're like, hey, the business doesn't simply have enough money to pay it back, so that business is going to have to shut down. The bank's going to have to shut down, and many people lose their life savings in the bank. That's the primary cause of this depression as a whole.